But back to Oz. It was Groucho Marx who said that politics is the art of looking for trouble, finding it everywhere, diagnosing it incorrectly, and applying the wrong remedies. On that basis, allow me to say that we have some truly outstanding politicians here in Australia of a calibre that Groucho would be extremely impressed by. And it is this Clayton's pandemic that has exposed them for the charlatans that many of them are, devoid of judgment and devoid of accountability. By the way, I say it's a Clayton's pandemic, not because I don't take the virus seriously. Of course I do, but simply because at this point in time, it appears from data around the world that the rate of infections does not lead to the predicted exponential growth in death rates. Surely critical in terms of defining the severity of any pandemic. Recently, the US Centre for Disease Control told us that 94% of COVID deaths had other comorbidities, 94%, such as influenza, pneumonia, hypertensive disease, diabetes, cardiac arrest, heart or renal failure, and so on, yet are still counted as COVID deaths. Indeed, in Australia, government bodies instruct doctors to assume a COVID death. That ain't science. On Friday, we learnt that a 20-year-old man whose reported coronavirus death terrified people across the nation, as we discussed earlier, may actually have died of a drug overdose. And we also know that nursing home deaths in Australia up until the end of July were lower than normal, not higher. Rather unusual, one might have thought, for a pandemic that mainly kills the elderly. Yet every day, the media and the politicians seek to terrify us with new COVID infections numbers. A new case here, a new case there, a cluster over there. Despite the fact that in France, for example, as we can see from this graph in the Financial Review, even though infection numbers are soaring, that's the red line scarily whizzing up, the actual deaths peaked back in early April and have flatlined ever since. That's that black line down the bottom. So I call it a Clayton's pandemic because the death toll, and by that I mean the number of people who otherwise would not have died, at this point in time simply does not justify the extremity of the measures being imposed upon so many traumatised and financially crippled Australians, particularly in Victoria and Queensland. And what despicable measures they are. This week, all of Australia was horrified by the story of Sarah Caislip. To quote The Australian, Miss Caislip's right to farewell her late father, surely one of the most fundamental human entitlements, was cruelly denied by a political machine so bereft of humanity that the best the 26-year-old Canberran got was a few minutes alone with the casket in the empty chapel 20 minutes after the funeral service had concluded. Yes, welcome to the machine, as Dave Gilmore once sang. In Queensland, that political machine, devoid of any humanity, crushed Sarah Caislip mercilessly and many, many others, with restrictions riddled with the most grotesque hypocrisy and illogical inconsistencies. So too in Victoria, where the curfew is, in one QC's opinion, as I mentioned earlier, illegal, and according to him, should be ignored. But try telling that to an out-of-control police force drunk on power.
Relax! Relax, she's sick! She's actually sick, relax! Hey! Relax! Relax!
Relax. In the Westminster system, bureaucrats are there to serve the politicians and the politicians are there to serve the people. Democratic government is built around two fundamental principles, judgement and accountability. But in Australia, Labor's state governments have grotesquely twisted this with hideously flawed judgement, followed by total unaccountability. The grinding political machine devoid of all humanity. Here's an example. Dr Jeanette Young, as Queensland's Chief Health Officer, in her judgment, even though Sarah Caislip came from Canberra, where there are currently 0 active corona cases, Sarah was forbidden from saying goodbye to her dying dad or going to his funeral. Why?
We know that funerals are very, very high risk for transmission of the virus.
Got it. So in Dr Young's judgment, funerals are high risk, except earlier in the year, it was her judgment that an Indigenous funeral was not.
This particular funeral happening in Mackay, I have been involved with, and I have seen some of the very difficult decisions. This is a very significant elder for that community who has died. And normally they would expect many, many hundreds, if not thousands of people to attend. So right from the word go, they significantly limited the number of attendees.
Right, tell that to Sarah Cayslip. Jeanette Young also told the Brisbane Times that, in her judgment, the reason for shutting down Queensland's schools was, quote, so you are really getting to people. Sometimes it's more than just the science and the health. It's about the messaging. So, nothing to do with science and health then? Oh, great judgment. Oh, and money comes into her judgments too.
I've given exemptions for people in entertainment and film because that's bringing a lot of money into this state.
Tell that to Sarah Cayslip as well. I would argue that this woman's judgment is not only hideously flawed, but is a sick joke. It is cruel, it is inconsistent, and it appears to be based on no sound scientific principles or data, just a whim. But that's why, in the Westminster system, even if the bureaucrat's judgment is flawed, is dodgy, is wrong, it is the elected politician who is held accountable. Or is it?
And let me make it very clear, I don't make those decisions. I said to the Prime Minister I would refer it to the Chief Health Officer, and I did that.
No. Premier Annastacia Palaszczuk, you are unfit for office. You have made a grotesque mockery of our parliamentary system and you have trashed the democratic principles that safeguard all of us. I urge every Queenslander watching this show now to devote every second of the next 7 weeks to persuading friends, family, people you bump into, the bloke down the street, the woman emptying the bins, that this disgrace of a premier must be thrown out of office for all of our sakes. But unbelievably, Dan Andrews in Victoria is even worse. Melbourne is currently under an 8 p.m. to 5 a.m. curfew that has no parallel anywhere else in the civilised world and has no scientific rationale. A lockdown that is destroying livelihoods and lives, the very opposite of what Scott Morrison promised us. So who's to blame? Well, Morrison, firstly, for stupidly empowering these clowns in the ludicrous National Cabinet, and secondly, for his cowardly decision to not challenge the insane border closures, the internal border closures between states in the High Court, which he said he would do when he had the chance to. Had he done so, which his colleagues urged him to, it's likely none of this would be happening now. But back to those bungling bureaucrats and political accountability. Here's Victoria's Chief Health Officer, Brett Sutton, explaining how the curfew decision was nothing to do with him.
I was consulted on it, but it was a separate decision-making pathway.
Oh, a decision-making pathway. Don't you love that bureaucratic language? So it's not his judgment. So it must be the police chief's judgment, right?
Were police consulted about the introduction of a curfew?
No.
Were you at no stage?
No. The reality is I was never consulted. I've made inquiries to determine if anyone within the organisation was briefed on the matter, and as best as I can work out, our policy area was provided a copy of the proposed guidelines for our information a couple of hours before they were signed off.
So, not his judgment either. So maybe the Premier, Dan Andrews, can enlighten the people of Victoria about precisely whose judgment it was to make the public suffer under virtual martial law.
Decisions are made by groups of people, and I can't necessarily pinpoint for you the exact individual and the exact moment that it was suggested that we put a curfew on. And what I'm saying to you is anyone who is displeased with that or doesn't think that's a proportionate measure, well, that's a decision that I've made.
Well, the fish really does rot from the top, doesn't it? Nobody made the decision, nobody is responsible, there's nobody to blame. It was just the machine.